World War was the largest armed conflict that the world had ever seen. The Great War. Since the summer of 1914 and over the next 4 years, more than 40 countries were fighting each other. On land, sea, and in the air. With no mercy, and to the bitter end. Crimes against the civilian populations of Serbia and Belgium. Gas among the trenches of the Western Front. Unrestricted submarine warfare waged by Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Allied blockade of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman genocide of the Greeks, the Syrians, and the Armenian people were just some among many faces of this war. By the time it ended in November of 1918, the Great War left over 20 million people wounded and more than 16 million dead. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the rise of the USA as the dominant world power, Nazism and the coming of Adolf Hitler to power were all direct products of the First World War, as was the Second World War. And then the Cold War in its many forms and shapes. The Balkan Wars of the 1990s. The everlasting Middle East crisis. In the summer of 1914, Europe was at peace. There hadn't been a major war for more than 50 years. The era known as Belle Époque. On June the 28th, on Franz Joseph Street in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, then part of Austria-Hungary, the heir to the Austrian throne was assassinated by a young Bosnian student. For that reason, a month later, Austria-Hungary was to declare war on Serbia. And 7 days after that, all of the European great powers would march into war. But why is it that the nations of Europe and the world went to war so readily? And how did the First World War ever come about? In the 1870s, 40 years before the Sarajevo assassination, Bosnia and Herzegovina were still a part of the Ottoman Empire. And this was so ever since the 15th century, when the Ottoman Turks had broken into Europe and conquered most of the Balkans. But now, after 4 centuries of the cruel regime, the empire's end was in sight. Throughout the 19th century, the Balkan peoples, the Serbs, Greeks, Bulgarians, and Romanians, had turned to arms to liberate their lands. Now the time came for Bosnia and Herzegovina.
The slogan, which was very popular, was Balkan to the Balkan people, meaning that great powers should not intervene and let Balkan people agree among themselves about their own future.
The plurality of the population of Bosnia actually is Serb. So I think it's natural for Serbia wanting to reunite those Serbs with the motherland, just as it was natural in 19th century terms that they would want the Serbs of southern Hungary and Slavonia to be reunited with the rest of Serbia.
But the future of Bosnia and Herzegovina was also a matter of principal interest to a great power. Since the mid-19th century, the foundations of the Austrian Empire were shaken by the revolutions and the civil war with the Hungarians. By 1860s, the Austrian Empire lost its Italian provinces in wars with Piedmont. And in war with Prussia, Austria lost its dominant position in the German Confederation. As both Italy and Germany were now unified at Austria's expense, the Emperor Franz Joseph was determined to prevent the further crumbling of the empire and reach the so-called compromise with the Hungarians. Although the name was now Austria-Hungary, the largest ethnic group within the empire were actually Slavs, who outnumbered both the Austrian Germans and the Hungarians together.
La grande crainte de Vienne, c'est que la Serbie n'actionne une politique en direction des Slaves du Sud de la monarchie, que Belgrade ne cherche à devenir le Piémont des Slaves du Sud.
Any extension of Serbia, which would embrace Bosnia-Herzegovina as well as some other districts, could not be reconciled with the standpoint of Austria-Hungary, a portion of whose subjects belong to the same race and might therefore become enthused with similar aspirations.
Elle peut accepter des États nationaux, mais qui restent d'une importance limitée, de telle sorte qu'elle puisse les contrôler. Si la Serbie annexait la Bosnie-Herzégovine, évidemment, elle deviendrait, avec cette annexion, une sorte d'État moyen. Et ça, elle ne peut pas l'accepter.
In the summer of 1875, gunfire was heard again in the mountains of Herzegovina.
It remained totally unknown that the Bosnian Serbs during these insurrections proclaimed on several occasions unification with Serbia, Bosnia with Serbia and Herzegovina with another Serbian state, which was the Principality of Montenegro.
In July of 1876, both Serbia and Montenegro declared war on the Ottoman Empire. But the destiny of Bosnia and Herzegovina had already been made.
Austria-Hungary cannot permit that Serbia occupy and keep the enclave between Dalmatia, Croatia and Slavonia, as this would mean a danger to the provinces of the monarchy, especially to its Dalmatian littoral, which, extending like a thin ribbon, would evidently have to be annexed to the new Serbia. It was agreed that Serbia should obtain an extension of territory in the Drina region in Bosnia, at the same time as in that of Novi Pazar in Old Serbia.
The rest of Bosnia and Herzegovina were to be annexed by Austria-Hungary. In order to secure Russian support for this, Austria was willing to do anything. If Russia was to wage war on the Ottomans, Austria-Hungary would observe an attitude of benevolent neutrality, but would also provide military logistics, field ambulances, the supply of armaments, as well as the diplomatic shield against other powers. so Russia could pursue her most important goal, the Straits of the Black Sea. In April 1877, Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. But in the peace conference in Berlin in the summer of 1878, the great powers decided that the Straits of the Black Sea would remain closed to the Russian war fleet. At the same time, they allowed Austria-Hungary to occupy Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also the Sanjak of Novi Pazar, so that Austria could keep Serbia and Montenegro apart. While Bosnia and Herzegovina were to be occupied and administered by Vienna, formally they would still remain a part of the Ottoman Empire. The Austro-Hungarian generals planned to complete the occupation by August the 18th, Franz Joseph's birthday. But they encountered fierce resistance, first from the Bosnian Muslims and then from the Orthodox Serbs. It took Austria-Hungary more than 150,000 troops, heavy artillery, and more than 3 months of war and reprisals against the local population to occupy Bosnia and Herzegovina.
The real point is that it gives prestige to Franz Joseph, who likes an extra little bit of territory because he's lost so much in the past. But Bosnia and Herzegovina is obviously a Slav territory. And there's no particular reason why the local population would want to be occupied by the Austrian army. And they don't. And they resist until resistance is put down after 2 or 3 years.
Germany had been united under the leadership of Prussia and her Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, over the course of 3 wars. In the war against Denmark in 1864, after the victory over Austria in 1866, and then over France in 1870 and 1871. At the helm of the victorious armies were the Prussian king, the future German Kaiser, Wilhelm, and the Chief of General Staff, Helmuth von Moltke.
What Bismarck did in unifying Germany was to place Prussia at the heart of Germany. And the heart of Prussia was the Prussian army, and at the heart of the Prussian army was the Hohenzollern monarchy. And that monarchy had a long tradition of fighting wars without giving notice.
But the new German Reich was quickly turning into the most progressive country in Europe. By the late 19th century, Germany had overtaken the United Kingdom, France, and Russia in almost all spheres. In overall industrial production, in the achievements in humanities and natural sciences, as well as in social care for the German workers. The standard of living was rising and the population would grow from 41 million in 1871 to 68 million in 1913. But Germany's further growth in the age of colonialism was constrained by the other great powers. In the scramble for Africa, Germany managed to acquire just 3 colonies, while the old colonial masters kept most of the world for themselves.
Although Germany is now very strong, she was a latecomer on the international stage, certainly a latecomer in terms of colonial possessions, and one of the foreign policy aims was to ensure that Germany has her rightful place in the sun internationally and her rightful state within the European concert or the balance of power.
Mit dem Platz an der Sonne war gemeint ein Wachstum des Kolonialreiches in Übersee, aber auch eine starke Stellung innerhalb Europas aufgrund der wirtschaftlichen Überlegenheit auch gegenüber den Nachbarstaaten und auch der militärischen Überlegenheit.
In 1888, Wilhelm's grandson, Wilhelm II, ascended the throne. He was to rule the German Empire for the next 30 years and be the last German emperor.
Wilhelm II was a very damaged person. The nerves were ripped out in his neck at birth. He was a breech baby. So he was a military monarch with a crippled left arm, which was very difficult. He always was trying to overcompensate for that disability by showing how bellicose he was, what a militarist he really was. Wilhelm II, as Kaiser, thought, well, the army has been built up by my grandfather, whom he called Wilhelm the Great, and my duty will be to put this army to effect so that I will make Germany into the hegemonial power in Europe. That was his great dream. The great model always was the quick victory, especially against France in 1870-71.
Now Germany was too small for the two leaders, and as soon as Wilhelm II was settled as the new Kaiser, Bismarck was dismissed.
За несколько дней до своей отставки Бисмарк обещает русскому послу графу Шувалову, что договор о перестраховке, который обеспечивал и Германию, и Россию от возможного столкновения, будет продлен. Каприви заявил, что он не жонглер, и что он не может одновременно держать в руках 3 шара. И один из этих шаров был потерян, это была Россия. Россия оказалась в изоляции, и результатом этого стало ускоренное движение России к заключению русско-французского союза.
A war against France in the West for Germany would now also mean a war against Russia in the East. A two-front war, nightmare for any military strategist.
Die Konsequenz davon war, dass im Falle eines Zwei-Fronten-Krieges das Deutsche Reich von beiden Seiten eingeschnürt werden würde und letzten Endes keine Chance haben würde, einen der beiden Gegner schnell zu besiegen. Aus diesem Grunde hat Moltke 1875 und auch 1887 gegenüber der Reichsleitung für einen Präventivkrieg, entweder gegen Frankreich oder gegen Russland, plädiert, um diese Zwei-Fronten-Situation zu bereinigen, bevor es zu einem Krieg gegen beide Seiten kommen würde.
But Bismarck had been strongly against it, and without the Chancellor's assent, not even the Kaiser could take Germany to war. But in 1890, Bismarck was no more, and Wilhelm II was to ensure that he becomes the sole ruler of Germany.
He, of course, over the years, appointed all the ministers, the Chancellor, all the generals. They were his appointees, and they behaved accordingly. They did not behave like Republican civilian statesmen. They behaved like courtiers or like militarists. The Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow would write on his cuff what the Kaiser had ordered, not because he thought he'd forget it, but to demonstrate to the Kaiser that he would always remember exactly what the Kaiser had said.
True to the tradition of German policy, we will make every effort to protect our rights and interests in East Asia and West India, without unnecessary harshness, but without weakness either. We do not want to put anyone in our shadow, but we also demand our place in the sun.
Setting on what they called the civilizing mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Austrians pledged
to introduce the agrarian reform and abolish serfdom, to raise the standards of living, to organize schools, to improve the taxation system, to reform the administration of justice, and to treat the three religious groups with equality.
the priority was to build modern roads and railways.
Most of the constructions undertaken by the Austro-Hungarian administration was to serve for exploiting the mining wealth of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and much less to anything else. There were 5 times more police stations in Bosnia built than schools. Social progress was reserved for a very thin layer of population.
In 1882, the Austria-Hungary's new finance minister, and thus the administrator of Bosnia and Herzegovina, became Benjamin von Carli, a historian and a former diplomat to Belgrade. He was to leave his mark on an era by remaining in his post for the next 21 years. This man, who had written the history of the Serbs, now had a task of keeping Bosnia and Serbia apart.
The Serbs had had hundreds of religious schools which were keeping their Serbian and Christian Orthodox tradition. Then Benny von Carli came and told them, "You are not Serbs anymore, you are now Bosnians." He imposed the Bosnian language, and he even banished his book, History of the Serbian People, which was published previous to the occupation of Bosnia, in which he claimed that all the population of Bosnia, and Bosnian Muslim in particular, are of Serbian origin. And the Bosnian Serbs wanted the same what they wanted in 1878. Human rights, civil rights, and to be free owners of the land they tilled.
But the occupational rule in Bosnia and Herzegovina never addressed any of the problems of the largest ethnic group. Carli had even prevented the agrarian reform. So, at the beginning of the 20th century, just as in the Middle Ages, the Christian peasants were still serfs, paying a third of their harvest to the Ottoman beys, who still owned the land. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian administration kept raising the state taxes, even higher than those imposed by the Ottomans. By 1910, 32 years into the Austro-Hungarian occupation, nearly 90% of the entire population of Bosnia and Herzegovina was still illiterate. This was unique in Europe. After the assassination of the autocrat King Alexander Obrenović and his consort in the spring of 1903, a group of military insurgents brought Peter Karađorđević to the Serbian throne. King Peter reintroduced democracy to Serbia, and it was through the parliament that the national unification ideas were to come to the forefront of the Serbian foreign policy again. At the same time, in the Austro-Hungarian provinces of Croatia, Slavonia, and Dalmatia, a new political force was emerging. In 1905, the Croatian and Serbian parties joined in the Croat-Serb coalition. Its main goal? Unification of the South Slavs.
Pour Vienne, ça semble indiquer qu'une menace se dessine à ses frontières. Aussi longtemps que la Serbie a été cet allié subordonné à l'Autriche-Hongrie, on n'avait pas cette crainte. Mais maintenant, tout semble en situation de changer. Et par conséquent, on voit se former à Vienne, dans les milieux politiques comme dans les milieux militaires, une inquiétude vis-à-vis de la Serbie. Une sorte, une obsession.
And it's not just Serbia. Serbia is a headache for people in Vienna. For people in Budapest, for the Hungarians, they are facing an even bigger headache to some extent with the Romanians. And so you have two irredentist, smaller states that are getting stronger every day on your southern borders. And this is what gives the Austrians this impression that they are really beleaguered and they are facing enemies all the way around. And Conrad, who was a little bit paranoid about Italy, he would say, you know, and this is another secret enemy. Italy is only waiting for its chance to attack us. So what we need to do is eliminate all these threats before they strike first, which is why Conrad's always arguing for preventive wars.
The Kaiser was also seeking ways to get Germany out of encirclement. In order to achieve this, it seemed only natural to use his family ties. First with his uncle, the British King Edward VII, and then young Nicky, the Russian Tsar Nicholas II, also a relative.
The Russian regiments must march with us. I believe that the prospect of raping and pillaging in beautiful France will lure the Russians to join us.
But Nicholas had other priorities. In 1904, Japan attacked Russia in Manchuria. And now, as the entire Russian army had been sent away to the Far East, in St. Petersburg, the revolution broke out. The revolution was to be extinguished in blood. In 1905, the Russian army and the navy suffered a devastating defeat in the war with Japan. Russia's military might was all but destroyed, and for Russia, it would take a long time to recover.
Russia was not able to fight in Europe. In other words, France was now at Germany's mercy. And it's in this situation that the chief of the German General Staff, Count Schlieffen, devises his Angriffsplan gegen Frankreich, a swift, lightning war against France.
Das Problem war allerdings, dass die deutsch-französische Grenze entlang den Vogesen von den Franzosen inzwischen befestigt worden war mit großen Festungsanlagen. Dort war ein schnelles Durchkommen unmöglich. Und deshalb hat Schlieffen einen Plan entwickelt, der darauf hinauslief, durch das neutrale Belgien, aber auch durch die neutralen Niederlande zu marschieren, um Frankreich sozusagen von
Nordosten her anzugreifen, in der Erwartung, dass die französische Armee sich dann zum Kampf stellen würde und dass man sie in einer riesigen Zangenbewegung dann in einer Kesselschlacht mit einem Schlag vernichten könne. Das war Schlieffens Idee, die er 1905 in diesem berühmten Memorandum, das wir jetzt als Schlieffenplan kennen, formuliert hat.
Still, a war could not begin without a major international crisis. Since 1830, France had put most of North Africa, Algiers and Tunisia under her colonial rule. Now she reached for the last remaining territory. But so did Germany.
Morocco was a European problem. There had been a conference at the end of the 19th century which decided that not a single European country should acquire a unilateral position in Morocco. And France, transforming Morocco in a protectorate, broke that agreement, actually. The Germans were not happy. They tried to force the French to stop that.
In March 1905, the Kaiser landed in the Moroccan port of Tangiers, offering the Sultan his support against France. Paris saw this as a direct threat, and soon Europe was on the brink of war.
What finally persuades the Kaiser not to attack is his realization that Britain would not allow France to be defeated. Both with her navy, which was totally superior, but also with a landing of 100,000 men somewhere on the continent. So for the first time, you had Britain clearly stating, we cannot tolerate the crushing of France, because we British would just be left facing a continent that's united under your leadership, and that's something we cannot tolerate.
The United Kingdom, the world's largest colonial power, had the largest naval force the world had ever seen. In 1897, under the Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, Germany had started building her own fleet, with the aim of matching that of the British. This then prompted the British admirals to insist on a preventive attack on the German Navy before it became too strong an opponent. But instead of a preventive attack, Great Britain took another giant step in securing its naval supremacy.
In 1905, Britain launches the first all-big-gun battleship, the Dreadnought, with 12-inch guns. Eventually, it'll aspire to have 15-inch guns, and ultimately, they're thinking about 18-inch guns. And that outclasses every existing battleship in the world. But then, of course, creates pressure on other navies to conform, and particularly, of course, Germany.
This presented the Germans with a huge dilemma, because the battleships that they'd been building so far were still small enough to go through the Kiel Canal from the Baltic Sea to the Atlantic or North Sea and back again. The new dreadnoughts were too large to go through that canal, which means that you had to go all the way around the top of Denmark. And so they had to decide not only whether we Germans will also now build dreadnoughts to match the British, and if we do, secondly, we will have to widen the Kiel Canal.
The Germans accepted the challenge. The undertaking to widen and deepen the 98-kilometer Kiel Canal began in 1907, as Germany started building her own dreadnought-class fleet. The naval arms race in Europe began.
There are really two arms races going on within Europe before the First World War. In 1897, the French develop a 75mm field gun, which can fire about 20 rounds a minute. That is a serious increase in the rate of fire of guns. And what that then does is create pressure for every other European army to acquire quick-firing artillery.
One of the first armies to introduce the cannon was the Serbian army in 1905. Drawn by its superior quality over the cannons made by Austrian Skoda and the German Krupp, but also by the offerings of a substantial French loan, the Serbian government for the first time decided not to buy weapons from Austria or Germany.
In Vienna, they were shocked when Serbia decided to sign treaties with other states without consulting Viennese diplomacy. They thought if Serbia wants to be independent, and 97% of Serbian export was dependent on Austria-Hungary, we will impose sanctions and Serbia will have to come back under our wing.
In January of 1906, Austria-Hungary enforced the trade embargo on the Serbian livestock exports, an economic clash known as the Pig War. But by 1911, Serbia would emerge from this war as a winner, eventually profiting more by finding new markets in France, Russia, Switzerland, and Germany.
It was political emancipation, economic emancipation, military emancipation. This is how Serbia became an attractive kind of Balkan Piedmont, especially for the Serbs, but also for other South Slavs.
The Serbs of the Orthodox and the Muslim faith hereby pledge to work and incite people towards getting the self-government for Bosnia and Herzegovina under the supreme rule of the Sultan. In accordance with its free will, the people shall decide on the country's social system and elect governors, alternately a Muslim and an Orthodox Serb.
In the elections of 1908 in the provinces of Croatia, Slavonia, and Dalmatia, the Croat-Serb coalition took a huge victory by winning 56 out of 81 seats in the parliament.
When the Croat-Serbian coalition took power in Croatia, in Vienna, they were very, very concerned. They were banning Serbian newspapers to be imported into Bosnia. They were putting people in prison. They were arresting Serbian leaders and accused them for high treason. And this is why Austria decided to make another blow, to proclaim annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina to Austria-Hungary.
On the last day of 1905, Kaiser Wilhelm II relieved Alfred von Schlieffen of his duty, and to the post of the Chief of German General Staff, he brought his personal adjutant. Kaiser called him Julius, but his real name was Helmut von Moltke, the Younger.
It was the Kaiser's choice, based more on a personal liking and, importantly, on the name, because Helmut von Moltke had his more famous uncle. Wilhelm II thought that somehow some of this would perhaps rub off. And in fact, the younger Moltke asked the Kaiser, "Are you thinking that you might win in the same lottery twice?"
You can do that little bit of piecework, but in times of war, I will be my own chief of the general staff.
As soon as Moltke was appointed, the state of affairs in Europe began to change. Russia slowly but steadily started recovering from the revolution and the war with Japan, and it seemed that her army would fully recover within 5 to 6 years. War on two fronts was again becoming a possibility, and like his uncle before him, Moltke the Younger would get determined to prevent that from happening.
Now or never. Jetzt oder nie, the sooner the better. At every opportunity he advocates war. At no point does he say, actually, let's just maybe hold back a bit, perhaps we're not strong enough. But at the same time, he is surrounded by people who say very similar things.
With Russia now back in the picture, the German deployment plan, the so-called Schlieffen Plan, needed an update.
The basic German strategic dilemma is a simple one. They're in the middle. If you're going to win quickly, you have to attack France first. You can't defeat Russia quickly. So the basic idea is you destroy the French army before Russia has time to mobilize and deploy its troops.
While Germany and Austria were covered by the dense railway network, Russia was not. Therefore, the deployment of the Central Powers armies was supposed to be much faster than that of the Russians. So while Germans would go and attack France, their rear, the Russian front, would have to be secured by the Austro-Hungarian army. Then, after a lightning victory over France in 6 to 8 weeks, most of the German troops would be transferred to the east and face the Russians.
Given the size of Russia, given the weakness of the railway network, given the ineffectiveness of Russian administration, the Germans think that they can do this.
We, Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria and Apostolic King of Hungary, to the inhabitants of Bosnia and Herzegovina. When a generation ago our troops crossed the borders of your lands, you were assured that they came not as foes, but as friends, to remedy the evils from which your fatherland had suffered so grievously for many years, and guide the country to a happier future. Order and security have replaced violence and oppression. Trade and traffic are constantly extending. The elevating influence of education has been brought to bear in your country, and under the shield of an orderly administration, every man may enjoy the fruits of his labors. In order to raise Bosnia and Herzegovina to
With these words, the Emperor Franz Joseph, after 30 years of occupation, proclaimed the annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina into the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Of course, it was a violation of international law, the Berlin Treaty. And naturally, Serbia was fiercely against it. They considered Bosnia to be kind of Alsace-Lorraine of Serbia, key provinces for future of Serbian and Yugoslav unification.
In Belgrade, the news of the annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina was met with outrage. The largest demonstrations the city had ever seen were organized. To try to diffuse the tension, Serbian Foreign Minister appealed to Vienna and eventually Berlin for compensations in territory, namely the Sanjak of Novi Bazar, from where the Austro-Hungarian army now withdrew. Serbia hoped to expand there and finally get a shared border with Montenegro. But this was not what Austria had in mind for Serbia at the time. A month before the annexation, on September the 5th, 1908, the Austro-Hungarian Foreign Minister, Ehrenthal, met with his German counterpart, Minister Schön, in Berchtesgaden, and told him in confidence that his plan, beyond the annexation, was the complete destruction of the Serbian revolutionary nest and partition of Serbia between Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria. Now it was also the Serbian press that called for war. As the army itself was unfit to fight, people close to the government and army circles began organizing thousands of volunteers in what was known as the National Defense, armed Chetnik squads willing to go to Bosnia and fight Austria-Hungary.
We must deliver a crushing blow to Serbia, regardless of the position of other powers.
An Austrian invasion of Serbia might lead Russia to intervene actively. With this, the casus foederis would arise for Germany.
But the Russians were secretly supportive of the Austro-Hungarian annexation plan. In September of 1908, in Buchlovice, Russian Foreign Minister Izvolsky gave Aehrenthal Russia's consent to the planned annexation.
Политика Извольского сводилась к тому, что у нас есть противоречия с Японией. В Манчжурии, например, в Корее. Мы решаем эти противоречия. Идем на уступки. У нас есть противоречия с Англией. В Афганистане, в Персии. Мы идем на соглашение, идем на уступки. У нас есть противоречия с Австро-Венгрией. Мы идем на соглашение с Австро-Венгрией. Почему? Что результатом всех этих уступок должна стать конференция, на которой будет пересмотрен вопрос о режиме проливов.
And while Austria-Hungary got the annexation, it failed to provide support for Russia one more time again. And the straits of the Black Sea were to remain closed for the Russian Navy. Now the Russian press called for war. And while Serbia was facing the Austrian ultimatum, the German one was delivered to St. Petersburg.
Как говорил маркиз Монте-Куколли, знаменитый австрийский военачальник, для войны нужно всего лишь 3 вещи. Это деньги, деньги, еще раз деньги. Да? Так вот, именно этого у русских финансов вплоть до 1908-1909 годов практически не было. И боснийский кризис застал русскую армию в положении, когда она не могла не только эффективно наступать, но даже эффективно обороняться.
Decision to collapse under Austrian threat and German ultimatum totally humiliates the Russian elite and makes everybody from Nicholas II down absolutely determined that Russia will not be humiliated again in that way.
What a good opportunity we missed of bringing the great European question to a decision.
And will probably not come back so soon, and under such favourable circumstances.
In 1911, Moroccan tribes revolted against the Sultan. This now served as a strong pretext for France to send her 20,000 troops and take full control of Morocco. In return, the Germans sent a small gunboat, the SMS Panther, to the Moroccan port of Agadir. But yet again, it was the British naval threat that deterred the Germans from taking any action. The German Navy was still far from ready to fight the British. The works on the Kiel Canal and the major U-boat base in the North Sea were well underway, but still several years away from their completion. The new naval law, brought in the same year, 1911, now allowed Germany to speed up her battleship production by 50%. Instead of building 2 major ships a year, she was to build 3, starting in 1917. With a drier tempo, Germany planned to reach the British naval supremacy in a matter of years.
But the other purpose of the Navy was to force Britain to her knees, simply because Britain, with her larger commitments all over the globe and her smaller manpower, would have to build 3 ships for every 2 the Germans built. So if the Tippett Navy was 60 ships strong, the British would have to build 90 ships. And economically, they just could not do that. And so Tippett says there will come a point when the British will break, where they will come to us and say, we can't go on, our hospitals are suffering, our schools are suffering, our whole economy is breaking. What can we do? What can we give you in return for your slowing down the naval arms race? And Tippett knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted Britain to sign a treaty with Germany, promising to stay neutral in the event of a war on the continent, regardless of how that war started. In other words, to give Germany carte blanche to attack France or Russia at any time they chose.
The decisive contest will start in September 1914. That date suits the Germans if ever they are going to fight. Both their army and fleet then mobilized, the Kiel Canal finished, and their new naval buildings complete.
In the spring of 1912, Britain and France made an agreement to bring all of their warships back to Europe and share defense responsibilities. The French fleet was to patrol the Mediterranean, and the British Royal Navy was to increase its presence in the North Sea. In July of 1912 in Paris, Generals Joffre and Zielinski signed a military convention. In the event of a German attack on France, Russia was to attack Germany within 15 days and push through Prussia towards Berlin. And inside Germany, politics were getting more and more complicated. In the 1912 elections, the Social Democratic Party won 35% of the seats in the Reichstag, thus becoming the strongest political party in Germany.
Germany is becoming more and more democratic internally and has the largest socialist movement, which is Republican, Marxist, and pacifistic. There is a real danger that the Social Democratic Party, the Catholic Centre Party, the Liberal Party will simply say this form of government that we have is not adequate for a modern society. And the more power those parties acquire, the less the militarist tradition will be able to be put into effect. So there's a time factor involved here. They see that very clearly, the German General Staff.
Russia has huge resources, both in terms of raw materials and in terms of population. So if the economy goes on growing at this rate, Russia is going to be a superpower in a way that really, in the world of that time, only the United States could match. Possibly the British Empire if the British Empire holds together, but certainly not a purely continental European country. And the fact that the future seems to belong to Russia deeply scares both German policymakers and broader sections of German society. So from the German perspective, you have this combination of fear and temptation. The sense that if you fight now, you'll probably win, whereas if you leave it for 10 years, you'll almost certainly lose.
There was also growing concern that by 1917, Russia would have fully recovered from the Japanese defeat and the 1905 revolution. The Russians were expected to complete their great military program and be firmly on their feet again. This time with 2 million soldiers.
Germany and Austria, they say we're losing ground in Europe. The others are getting more and more powerful and we can't catch up. And it's not so much armaments, but railway building by the French in Russia. That is the big threat.
In 1912 and 1913, Russia received a major French loan. The condition was that they build strategic railways in Western Russia. Railways leading to the German border.
And within 3 or 4 years, Russian mobilization would be just as quick as the Austrians, maybe even not quite as the Germans. So you can no longer have the Schlieffen Plan after 1917. You can still fight the war on 2 fronts now. In a few years' time, you'll no longer be able to do that. And that is really the basic argument for a preventive war. So in global terms, World War I is a sort of preventive war against the Russian railway building program.
It's obvious that if you are the chief of the German General Staff, you're not going to wait until your enemies are ready. It's quite natural that you plan to do the attacking yourself, to surprise the others. The trouble with that is that it looks like a war of aggression, which indeed it would have been, which your own people would not support. Your allies would not even support it if it looks like you are taking the initiative in starting this war. So the whole war had to be disguised.
It was crucial for Berlin to appear to be attacked. There was a lot of talk about how we need to appear to be attacked so that all the population will be behind us and that perhaps Britain will stay out of the war.
I prepare the German mind for this by newspaper articles written by the General Staff to represent Russia as barbaric, killing its own people, shooting its own people in Petrograd, and so on. But secondly, the best way is to push Austria in the Balkans into a war against Serbia. Perhaps I don't have to push because they want to do it anyway, but we will be very supportive.
The experience of the Moroccan crisis had shown that they couldn't really rely on the Austrian ally in a crisis that didn't directly affect their own interests. So a Balkan crisis was considered in Berlin to be really pretty crucial and important if you wanted perhaps to provoke a war.
If then, which I thought was very likely, 90% likely, Russia supports Serbia and declares war on Austria, then we will look as if we're only coming to the aid of our ally. We will not seem like the aggressors, even though our attack is actually against France before we can sweep our army against Russia. And the greatest prize of all in this plan of Bethmann-Hollweg's was to keep Britain neutral in what would look like a war in the Balkans, a long way away.
The Austro-Hungarian annexation of 1908 incited the creation of many groups and secret societies of young Bosnians. One was the progressive Serbo-Croat youth of Sarajevo, and one of its members, Gavrilo Princip. And in Serbia, there was a secret society of Serbian army officers called Unification or Death, better known as the Black Hand. One of its leaders was Lieutenant Colonel Dragutin Dimitrievich, Apis, the man who organized the 1903 coup d'etat. Now he also aimed to bring down the Prime Minister, Nicola Pasic, and his government. The Black Hand and the revolutionary and nationalist groups in Bosnia shared a common goal: to free Bosnia and Herzegovina of Austro-Hungarian rule.
The main target of Serbian policy was to finish with the Ottoman rule in Old Serbia, which is Vilayet of Kosovo, and Vilayet of Monastir, which is Slavic Macedonia. So Bosnia was apart from any plans of Serbia to foment revolt or any kind of internal turmoil. The main focus was the south.
In order to fully liberate their lands from centuries of Ottoman rule, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece and Montenegro commenced military operations against the Ottoman Empire on October the 8th, 1912.
One of the most important elements in Serbian strategy during the First Balkan War was to obtain an access to the Adriatic Sea and to have a direct territorial link for its exports into the third countries. Because the tariff war by Austria-Hungary has shown that Austria is doing everything to block Serbia's export and to bring her back into their political influence.
Pour Vienne, il est essentiel de limiter l'extension de la Serbie. Il n'est pas acceptable de laisser la Serbie arriver jusqu'à l'Adriatique. Et le moyen de l'empêcher, c'est de créer un État albanais.
The tension between Vienna and Belgrade was becoming critical. In Berlin, all saw this as a welcome opportunity. All but one.
In November 1912, even the Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, and Kittel and Wächter, the Foreign Secretary, as well as the generals, are urging Wilhelm II that the thing to do is to encourage Austria to attack Serbia before Serbia can reach the Adriatic. And Wilhelm is reluctant. He has a plan B in mind. Plan B is that instead of Austria attacking Serbia, it should bribe Serbia, give them lots of money, he says. And then when the war against Russia comes, the Serb army will be integrated with the Austro-Hungarian army, and we can defeat Russia all the better.
It is often said that Germany has no need to fight for Austria's Albanian or Adriatic interests, or even for the harbour at Durazzo. But that is not what is at stake. If Austria has to fight for her position as a great power, regardless of the cause, then we must stand at her side, so as not to have to fight alone at a later stage with a weakened Austria beside us.
Austria-Hungary could count unconditionally on the support of the German Reich. Germany's sword is already loose in its scabbard.
On November the 21st, 1912, the Kaiser ordered his new ambassador to London, Prince Lichnowsky, to ascertain what the British position would be in the event of a continental war. The very next day, November the 22nd, Conrad's replacement, General Blasius Chamois, and the Archduke Franz Ferdinand came in secret to Berlin to meet the Kaiser and Moltke.
Moltke entirely understood our situation vis-à-vis Russia and Serbia. He promised not merely to stand guard, but to launch a forceful offensive action in parallel with ours.
Kaiser Wilhelm especially gracious. willing to support us in everything. Full security in this respect. Absolutely against the Conference of the Powers.
In his speech on December the 2nd, 1912, the Chancellor, Bettmann Hollweg, pledged full German support for Austria-Hungary in front of the Reichstag and the whole world.
So that is, if you like, a blank check given both secretly and in public. The Kaiser, but also Moltke and Bettmann Hollweg all make it clear to the Austrian leadership that Germany would be in support if they attack Serbia.
They brought such an enormous army that in Belgrade they thought that the war is imminent, that the war will erupt within weeks, at the moment when the most of the Serbian troops were in the south, guarding the new territories.
On December the 8th, the Kaiser read Lichnowsky's telegram from London.
In a general European conflict that might arise from an Austrian invasion of Serbia, it is hardly likely that Great Britain would be able to remain a passive observer. England could therefore under no circumstances tolerate the crushing of France. England cannot be and is not willing to be confronted afterwards by a united continent under the leadership of one single power.
The Kaiser was furious. He called up a meeting. It would become known as the War Council. It took place on the Sunday morning, December the 8th, 1912, in the Berlin Palace.
Austria must deal energetically with the Serbs, otherwise she will lose control of the Slavs in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. If Russia supports the Serbs, which she evidently does, then war would be unavoidable for us too.
I believe a war is unavoidable, and the sooner the better.
Moltke says, the sooner the better, we are ready, any delay is going to put us at a disadvantage. But it's Tirpitz who swings the meeting by saying the Navy would prefer to see the great fight, he says the great fight, to be postponed for a year and a half until the Kiel Canal is ready in the summer of 1914.
The very next day, December the 9th, work began on the new army bill. The army budget was to increase by a staggering 35% and reach 2.4 billion Deutschmarks in 1913. The army's troop strength would be increased by 140,000 men by 1914.
The creation of a strong Serbian empire must be prevented. It is vital not to get encircled by the ring of Slavs. The solution can be deferred, but the question will come up again in 1 or 2 years. It will be necessary to create a Balkan state which does not look towards Petersburg, but Vienna. And Turkey will have to be strengthened again.
But back in December of 1912, Austria-Hungary was still gathering a massive military force just outside Belgrade.
They now had to be pulled back again, had to be told, no, well, actually, we've changed our minds because of this. So the Kaiser writes to Franz Ferdinand, Moltke writes to Konrad von Hötzendorf, Bettmann Hollweg writes to Berchtold and say, no, actually not yet, wait.
And then the Austrians say, all right, let's say the Balkan for the Balkan peoples, because if you follow ethnic lines of conduct, then Serbia is going to win fairly little, because Macedons are regarded as Bulgarians, the Kosovo has an Albanian majority, they believe, so Serbia will gain almost nothing. So they are waiting for the second round of arguing. They're waiting for the Balkan Entente to fall apart and for the victors in the First Balkan War start fighting each other.
On June the 29th, 1913, with the Bulgarian attack on the Serbian and Greek troops, the Second Balkan War began.
The Austrians tell the Bulgarians, we'll support you, but only if you buy off the Romanians. If you bribe the Romanians with territory, then we'll actually join you in jointly defeating Serbia. The Bulgarians refused to hand over territory to the Romanians, and so the Austrians say, all right, if that is so, then our offer lapses. And the Bulgarian Tsar is furious. He says, who could have thought that you would miss this perfect opportunity for wiping Serbia from the map? And as it happens, of course, the Bulgarians on their own, they're being defeated. And in itself, that's a big defeat for Austrian foreign policy.
Now Bulgaria and Austria's interests were united in defeat, and Bulgaria was to become an important ally for the Central Powers, as was the Ottoman Empire. Germany was building the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad, while the German general Otto Lehmann von Sanders was in charge of rebuilding the Turkish army on the German model. Now, Russia was getting encircled.
The basic point from the Russian perspective is that Serbia is their most reliable ally in the Balkans. It's the only country on which they can depend because, unlike everybody else, Serbia has no one else to look to. The Bulgarians can play the Russians and Austrians off against each other. So can the Romanians. The Greeks can look to Germany, they can look to Britain. So can the Turks, even. But Serbia, because of its commitment to a basically anti-Austrian line, has no one to look to but Russia. It's therefore a secure ally in a way. And it's an ally which looks even more valuable after the two Balkan Wars.
The weapon that stood out in the Balkan Wars was the French Schneider Creusot 75mm cannon.
That brought confidence to the French general staff. They were also convinced that the Serbian army had become quite a good army. They had great respect for what was called at the time military virtues of the Serbian people, reliable and tough, willing to sacrifice themselves.
The Serbian generals are saying, look, we're very vulnerable at the moment because, Serbia is attempting to absorb these newly conquered areas. The army has to reorganize itself. We need a new system of mobilization. We need all sorts of things. Give it 3 years, we and the Montenegrins will be able to put 500,000 men in the field against Austria. That is a huge potential advantage to Russia. That means 3-4 Austrian army corps less on the Eastern Front. So at that level, this is straight realpolitik. At another level, it isn't. It's to do with appeals to Slav solidarity.
In the autumn of 1913, tensions were again on the rise. In putting down the Albanian insurgents, the Serbian army had penetrated deeply into Albania and pushed for the Adriatic coast again. Austria-Hungary now demanded full Serbian withdrawal from the newly formed country. And in the Alsace-Lorraine town of Saverne, a racial incident between a German officer and the local French population threatened to escalate into an open conflict.
At exactly that same time, October-November 1913, the King of the Belgians, Albert, comes to Berlin and is told both by the Kaiser and Moltke, we are about to go to war with France. The German people will be so up for it that nothing will stop the furor Teutonicus, And you had better be on our side, because the penalty of being against us will be terrible for you.
Within days, Albert reported Wilhelm's threat to the French government. But for Paris, this was hardly news. In 1905 and 1911, war with Germany over Morocco was narrowly avoided. So in 1913, Poincaré's administration extended the military service from 2 to 3 years, increasing the number of active troops from 480,000 to 750,000.
Poincaré was convinced that there was a danger for France to be drawn into a very difficult war against Germany, and he did not want to do anything which might endanger Russian help in that case, in case of war. As soon as Poincaré became president of the Council, Prime Minister, if you prefer, in 1912, he sent to St. Petersburg as his ambassador Delcassé, who was a former foreign minister, who was the architect of the Franco-British Entente, and who had already, starting in 1898, reinforced the Franco-Russian alliance. That was a sign, an indication to the Russians, we mean it seriously.
During his post as ambassador in St. Petersburg, Théophile Delcassé conducted comprehensive talks with the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Sazonov. Possibility of war was an unavoidable subject.
If it comes to a war, then we must try to win it. They were pretty sure they could win it. And in that case, we are going to solve a whole series of problems. We are going to solve the problem of German hegemony in Europe. We are going, of course, to take back Alsace-Lorraine, which had been lost to the Germans in 1871. The Russians will take the Prussian part of Poland. The Austrian-Hungarian problem will be solved with annexation of Galicia by the Russians, and probably with the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
On October the 18th, 1913, Belgrade received yet another ultimatum. For the third time in a year, Austria-Hungary threatened war on Serbia, now giving her 8 days to completely withdraw from Albania.
After the two exhausting Balkan wars, which costed Serbia almost £1 billion, the whole state was on the edge of exhaustion. Serbia was lacking 120,000 rifles only. Cannons and ammunition was needed. Half of the army was in the hospitals. And Serbia needed at least 20 years of peace in order to absorb these new territories. Therefore, her main interest was to remain in friendly relations with Austria-Hungary.
So once again, Serbia gave in under the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum.
The Austrians faced the frustrations of success because outwardly the Austrians get what they want. They want annexation of Bosnia in 1909, they get it. They want Serbia not to have a port on the Adriatic coastline in 1912, and they get that. They want Serbia to withdraw from Albania in 1913, and they get what they want. On the other hand, they realize it's all Pyrrhic victories. It doesn't really benefit Austria. Serbia gets stronger and stronger. And each of these crises costs the Austrian an enormous sum of money, because they always issue an ultimatum. They always mobilize half their troops. They send all their troops to Bosnia and to the border, and it costs them hundreds of millions of crowns. So that after the last mobilization at the end of 1913, Francis Joseph, who basically favored a peaceful policy until then, he said, this is the end of it. We can no longer have another mobilization short of war. Next time it has to be all or nothing.
Today, we use the phrase, we live in a globalized world. In 1914, people thought they lived in a globalized world too.
This is a very sophisticated society and civilization. This is the world of Stravinsky and Chagall. This is the world of, you know, insurance companies which already have hundreds of thousands of insurance policies, newspapers which have hundreds of thousands of readers. In a way, it's almost postmodern.
But the time around the turn of the 20th century was also the time of political assassinations. Presidents and prime ministers of Bulgaria, Spain, the USA, Russia, and France were killed during this period, as were members of the royal families of Japan, Portugal, Russia, Italy, and Greece. Among others, King Alexander and Queen Draga Obrenović of Serbia, and the Austrian Empress Elizabeth, the wife of Franz Joseph.
In the early June, there was a government session in Belgrade. Pasic was presiding, and there was a report from the civilian authorities on the border with Austria-Hungary that military officers were organizing illegal transfer of certain persons and weapons into Bosnia. When they saw that the military officer who transferred the 3 young Bosnians is Major Vulović, who was one of the closest friends of Apis, they knew that Apis is probably behind this venture.
I was convinced that the maneuvers in Bosnia were just a pretext for the Austrian invasion of Serbia, with Franz Ferdinand leading the way. Before our troops could return from the south, Serbia would have been overrun, and the world would face a fait accompli. So, when Tankosic came to me and said some Bosnian youths, they keep pestering me to let them go to Bosnia and try something against Ferdinand, I said, well, let them go.
Pasic immediately demanded investigation. And just in case, he sent the cable to his most loyal diplomat to Vienna, Jovan Jovanović, asked him to warn about possible turmoil in Bosnia during the visit of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
The Serbian ambassador to Vienna, he actually approaches Bielinski, who's formerly in charge of administering Bosnia, and tells him there are rumors about an assassination attempt and they should be careful.
On June the 24th, 1914, the Kiel Canal was finished. The passage from Baltic to the North Sea was now open for the German dreadnoughts. The same day, June the 24th, the Austro-Hungarian Foreign Ministry finished a diplomatic document known as the Macheco Memorandum, addressing the leaders of both Austria-Hungary and Germany.
The idea to free the Christian Balkan peoples from the Turkish rule in order to use them as a weapon against Central Europe has always been Russia's interest in these peoples. To put up quietly with this unilaterally shifted situation is not possible for the monarchy, from military political reasons. For these reasons, it is in the joint interest of the monarchy as much as Germany's to oppose promptly and energetically a development aspired to by Russia and supported by her, which it will later no longer be possible to revert.
The Kaiser issues the order to the ambassador in London on the 16th of June, 1914, to discover how Britain will position herself if that continental war breaks out. 16th of June. A few days before that, Moltke and the Foreign Secretary Gottlieb von Jagow are traveling back by car from Potsdam to Berlin. And Moltke issues virtually a command to the Foreign Secretary to direct his policy in such a way as to begin a preventive war soon.
I have the feeling that we are going into the storm. At what point on the horizon and just when it will break out, I could not say exactly. But from now on, the war is both predetermined and not far off.
It was recognized that if Franz Ferdinand went to the maneuvers in Bosnia-Herzegovina, that he was taking a risk. And he himself does not seem to have been particularly enthusiastic about undertaking this mission.
Since 1910, there had been 5 attempts on the lives of Austro-Hungarian governors of Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia. In 1910, during the Emperor Franz Joseph's visit, several thousand soldiers had secured the streets of Sarajevo. But the visit of Franz Ferdinand on Vidovdan, the Serbian national holiday, was supervised by no more than 36 of local policemen, although more than 20,000 troops were stationed just outside the city. At the moment when their commander-in-chief was entering in an open-topped car. In the second attempt of the day, Franz Ferdinand was killed.
If we disregard this opportunity, the monarchy shall be left at the mercy of a renewed onset of Yugoslav, Czech, Romanian, and Italian aspirations. The assassination in Sarajevo is Serbia's declaration of war against us.
It's not that the Serbian government wanted the assassination at Sarajevo, certainly not. It's perfectly clear that it's in Serbia's interest to postpone the conflict. This is in the midst of a tremendous struggle within Serbia between the army leadership and the government. I think Apis Dimitrievich was actually, as much as anything, acting in order to undermine passage.
The assassination was the genuine endeavor of Gavrilo Princip and his friends. And I have discussed this with Professor Vaso Čubrilović on many occasions. They did not think that they were obliged something to the Black Hand. They just came to obtain weapons to pursue their goal in Bosnia.
The people suffer because they're impoverished completely and are being treated like cattle. I wanted to avenge that, and I'm not sorry.
There is nothing to prove or even to suppose that the Serbian government is accessory to the inducement for the crime or the furnishing of weapons. On the contrary, there are reasons to believe that this altogether is out of the question.
There was certainly a war party in Austria-Hungary before the assassination, centered around two people in particular, Konrad von Hötzendorf as the Austro-Hungarian Chief of the General Staff, who repeatedly pressed for a preventive war against Serbia, some say about 20 times, and latterly Berchtold, the foreign minister. And so for them, of course, if there is a warning coming from Serbia about the possibility of assassination, that isn't necessarily something they want to pay attention to.
I expressed to His Majesty my belief in the unavoidability of war with Serbia. His Majesty said,
Yes, that is entirely correct. But do we want a war if everyone is against us, especially Russia?
Don't we have our flank covered by Germany?
Last night a note was sent to Germany in order to get an answer.
If the answer says that Germany stands on our side, could we then go to war against Serbia?
Then, yes.
Franz Josef knew that the war would turn into World War. When Belinsky, the finance minister, put it to Franz Josef, you know, this will mean a European war, Franz Josef just muttered, yes.
The reply that comes back via the Austrian ambassador in Berlin, Count Sojourny, is a resounding, yes, we will support you, regardless of if what you do results in Russia becoming involved, results in a European war.
The Kaiser writes the famous and fatal Jetzt oder nie, now or never. We must clear up with the Serbs. Mit den Serben muss aufgeräumt werden, which acted as a signal to start the war, in effect.
This is the famous blank check that Berlin issues to Vienna. It's not just an encouragement, they are also putting pressure on Vienna.
Berlin expects the dual monarchy to take action against Serbia and would not understand if we let this opportunity pass without striking a blow.
On July the 7th, the Austro-Hungarian government reached the following conclusion.
All present, except the Royal Hungarian Premier, hold the belief that a purely diplomatic success would be worthless. And therefore such far-reaching demands must be addressed to Serbia, which will make a refusal almost certain, so that the road to a radical solution by means of military action should be opened.
Berchtold's wife actually wrote a letter to a cousin saying, poor Leopold, he couldn't sleep last night. He kept getting up and changing the terms of the ultimatum. He was so worried the Serbs might accept it.
The ultimatum against Serbia was really written to be rejected. And everybody said who read it, this is really a strongly worded document, isn't it? That's what the emperor himself said. But he knew what he was doing. He said, we don't want another compromise solution. We don't want another conference that will lead to nothing. What the Austrians really wanted was Serbia to vanish into thin air.
The summer of 1914 was to be called Europe's last summer. Perhaps that was why, as Stefan Zweig wrote in his World of Yesterday, it was more luxuriant, more beautiful, and more summery. On the surface, nothing indicated the catastrophe soon to come.
all the important decision makers are sent away on holiday, as had previously been planned, so as not to alert anyone to the fact that behind the scenes trouble was brewing. So Moltke goes on his second cure that year to Karlsbad, Jago is on his honeymoon in Switzerland, and in Vienna, similarly, Konrad von Hötzendorf is away, and it's the deputies who liaise with each other while the leading figures are away.
The Kaiser also took his annual cruise.
They send him off to Norway, telling him, Your Majesty, it's got to look as if we know nothing, because that's the German case. We're innocent. It's the Austrians who are pulling us into this at a later stage. So please go on your annual cruise, otherwise it would look fishy. But please don't go further than just north of Bergen, because then it'll take too long for you to get back.
Nur Bethmann blieb in der Nähe von Berlin und hatte nun eine ganz seltene Situation zu seinen Gunsten, nämlich er konnte alleine entscheiden. Vor allen Dingen konnte er alleine entscheiden vor dem Hintergrund, dass der Kaiser vor seiner Abreise in martialischen Tönen ja davon gesprochen hatte, dass man nun mit Serbien endlich abrechnen müsse, hatte also durchaus sich kriegswillig gezeigt. Und Bethmann-Hollweg konnte nun eine Politik verfolgen, die ganz im Sinne des Kaisers, wie er meinte, war, nämlich auf den allgemeinen Krieg zu steuern.
The Austro-Hungarian government had completed its ultimatum to Serbia by July the 12th, but it would be another 11 days before it was delivered to the Serbian government.
There is a long delay before that ultimatum can be delivered, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is that the Austrian soldiers are on harvest leave and you can't simply recall them. This would cause suspicion, of course, elsewhere, and also you do need to have the harvest in if you want to go to war. And the other reason is that there is an official visit by the French president to Russia, and you don't want to deliver your ultimatum at a point in time when the French president and the Russian foreign minister can sit down together and discuss their response.
Still, the Russians and the French had good anticipation of things to come. On July the 21st, 1914, President Poincaré met the Austro-Hungarian ambassador to Russia, Count Zápary, and warned him openly that the war against Serbia could draw Russia and consequently France in. Zápary left without a word.
Poincaré told Nicholas, the Russian Tsar, you must be firm and you must stand by the Serbs. You must not let Austria bully the Serbs as they want to do, because then Austria will have a sort of huge victory, and then the Austrian and German problem would become even worse for Paris and St. Petersburg.
On July the 23rd, just as Poincaré left St. Petersburg by ship, the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum was delivered to the Serbian royal government in Belgrade.
They called Pasic to come back from the electoral campaign. He was deep in the south of Serbia. When they read the ultimatum, one of the ministers said, "Oh my God, there is nothing left but to die again."
When Sazona first sees the Austrian ultimatum, he says this is the European war. There is no way the Austrians could have written something like this unless they had a firm German guarantee. And also says 48 hours. You know, you don't give someone an ultimatum like this in 48 hours unless you're pretty convinced there's going to be war.
Serbian reply was delivered to Baron Giesel, the Austro-Hungarian ambassador to Belgrade, by the Prime Minister, Nikola Pasic himself.
When he entered the Austrian legation, Baron Giesel was already packed. He was ready to leave. He had an instruction to leave Belgrade, whatever the answer of Serbia will be.
Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, tries at that stage to re-invoke the spirit of the Concert of Europe, the idea of the Congress system. Let's get the great powers together to talk about this, rather than going to war. If it had been agreed to, two things would have followed. First of all, Austria-Hungary wouldn't have had its war against Serbia. They would be back to square one. The Serb problem would just resurrect itself in a matter of years, and they would have to do it all over again, probably in less favorable circumstances. And secondly, from Germany's point of view, the opportunity to split the alliance, facing them the Entente, would have gone as well. At that point, Beckmann-Hollweg, as the German Chancellor, says no, not.
On July the 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia in a telegraphic note. The same evening, the shelling of Belgrade began from Zemun and the Danube.
I appeal to you to help me. An ignoble war has been declared to a weak country. The indignation in Russia, shared fully by me, is enormous. I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed and be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war. To try and avoid such a calamity as a European war, I beg you, in the name of our old friendship, to do what you can to stop your allies from going too far. Nikki.
Россия не может не заступиться в этой ситуации за Сербию. А любое заступничество, если оно не будет сопровождаться демонстрацией силы, не будет воспринято в Вене и Берлине серьезно. С другой стороны, эта вооруженная демонстрация не должна была автоматически, с точки зрения Николая II, привести к войне.
If Russia mobilizes against Austria, my role as mediator will be endangered, if not ruined. Willie.
There is a sense in which Russia will be declaring mobilization. We don't quite know when it will happen, but Germany needs to declare her own mobilization and, more importantly, needs to send troops into Luxembourg and Belgium before war has been declared. Does that not happen, and is Liège not taken within the first 11 days, the whole plan has failed and Germany will lose the war. This puts an enormous time pressure on the decision makers in Berlin, and they decide in a meeting that regardless of what Russia will do, on the 31st of July, we will have to issue the order to march into Belgium. They will then later on say that this was done in response to Russia's mobilization, but actually the decision, as we know from secret documents, was taken regardless of Russia's decisions.
On July the 30th, Tsar Nicholas II ordered the mobilization of the Russian military districts on the Austro-Hungarian border.
Your troops were mobilized against Austria-Hungary, my ally. The responsibility for the disaster which is now threatening the whole civilized world will not be laid at my door. Willie.
The Russians partially mobilize. In other words, they mobilize that bit of their army which is on the Austrian border, in order to warn the Austrians that they will not allow Serbia to be destroyed without antagonizing Germany. The Russian military leadership revolts at the idea of partial mobilization because they say it is just going to wreck general mobilization when that is needed. And as a result of that, Nicholas II, in the end, caves in and goes for general mobilization. This is then used by the Germans, always subsequently, to say that it's the Russians who started the war, not them.
The mood is brilliant. The government has succeeded very well in making us appear like the attacked.
The Kaiser signed the mobilization order on a desk that was cut from the British ship Victory, which was Lord Nelson's ship at the Battle of Trafalgar. There is exultation in Berlin. One general reports beaming faces everywhere. Yeah, we're over the hump, we've done it.
Erich von Falkenhayn, the Prussian Minister of War, says even if we perish over this, at least it was fun, at least it was beautiful.
For the first time in 30 years, I feel myself to be an Austrian and feel like giving this not very hopeful empire another chance.
The declaration of war was received well in Vienna. There were jubilant crowds. The idea was that it would be a quick little war and that Austria was obviously going to win it. They think the main role of Germany is to support the Austrian plan to defeat Serbia. But the Germans, who've got their own priority, and their priority is the Schlieffen plan, they now want the Austrians to cover them on the Russian front and forget about Serbia. And they say, well, look, Serbia's not all that important. They also say to the Austrians, in order to keep the Italians out, why don't you give up part of your Italian territories? And the Austrians were flabbergasted.
In der Nacht vom 30. zum 31. Juli hatte sich eine gespenstische Szene im Generalstab abgespielt. Moltke empfing seinen Adjutanten Major von Haften und dann erzählte ihm Moltke, was das für ein Krieg werden würde. Nämlich ein Krieg, der die europäische Zivilisation auf Jahrzehnte hinaus zerstören würde. Ein Krieg, der jahrelang dauern würde, vor allen Dingen jetzt, nachdem auch Großbritannien in den Krieg eingreifen würde. Er sprach von einer allgemeinen Katastrophe und laut den Aufzeichnungen Haftens wandte er sich dann mit Tränen an den Augen zu dem Porträt seines Onkels, des älteren Moltke, geradezu flehend. Also Moltke war von dieser Situation, dass es nun zum Krieg kam, geradezu entsetzt. Und das, obwohl er ja früher immer geradezu den Präventivkrieg gefordert hatte.
But on the morning of August the 1st, 1914, this was still not a European war. The same day, the German leaders received important news from Ambassador Lichnowsky in London.
Lichnowsky suggests that Sir Edward Grey has offered the possibility of neutrality. This is taken as a great victory for Germany. A second telegram even promises that this neutrality might be accompanied by French neutrality.
The Kaiser calls for champagne. Everybody thinks this is wonderful. At one point, the Kaiser actually orders Moltke to change all his plans and attack not France, but only Russia. And Moltke has a nervous breakdown. He says, Your Majesty, you can't do this. This is an army of several million people. We cannot just take them from where they're supposed to go with all these plans and send them the other way.
If we change the plan, you will not have an army, you will have a heap of disorganized men. To which the Kaiser replies, tragically, I think, your uncle would have given me a different answer.
Later, the same night, another telegram arrived from Prince Lichnowsky.
And then, of course, the clarification comes from London to say, no, I got it wrong. The British will not allow France to be crushed. They will enter the war. And then the Kaiser, who's by this time in his pajamas, says to Moltke, okay, now do what you want, and goes back to sleep, and then has a nervous breakdown himself.
Thank you.